everybody. Today I am driving a Honda Civic Type R. This is the FK2, and I'd very much forgive you if you had forgotten entirely that this car ever existed. You see, this car seemed to be in showrooms for about a fortnight and then vanished. And it arrived with an awful lot of fanfare because at the time it debuted in about 2015, there hadn't been a Civic Type R in production for half a decade. So expectations were set rather high, particularly as the FN2 was a disappointment in the eyes of many. Now, of course, the big thing was the move to turbocharging. This car having a boosted version of the famous K20 engine, putting out just over 300 horsepower as standard. Chassis-wise, it's actually pretty similar to the FN2, having a torsion beam set up at the rear. And in this car, Honda were proud to tell everybody that it was so stiff, it didn't even need an anti-roll bar at the back. And for those who'd moaned about how stiff and unruly the FN2 was, that really wasn't going to be music to their ears. The car then turned up in showrooms and I saw a few of them, mostly sat there because apparently they had an appetite for lunching their own gearboxes and suspension components as well. And then 5 minutes later, they were gone. A couple of years on, the FK8 arrived, everyone said, "Isn't this brilliant?" and this car was subsequently entirely forgotten. I do see them on occasion and I've often long wondered what they're like. A few people I know that are really into their Japanese stuff have said they think this is actually the last proper Type R and that the FK8 is sort of too smooth and soft and cosseting and designed for lazy Americans. Well, happily, thanks to a lovely chap called David, I'm now able to tell you all what this car is like. At first impressions, it does seem like it shares an awful lot of DNA with the FN2. The shape is broadly the same, although tragically this car is available only as a 5-door, where the FN2 had a lovely 3-door shape about it. But the overall profile is very familiar. That does bring some benefits with it as well as drawbacks, the biggest one being the fact that this car is ludicrously spacious. I mean, seriously, these things are van-like if you put the rear seats down, and even without doing that, the amount of storage space in this thing is absolutely gobsmacking. They're incredible, they really are. At normal speeds, there's actually a lot to really quite like about it. The driving position is pretty good, if a touch high. The seats are fantastic, typical Type R hallmark, and you've got this sort of space-age dash, an evolution of what you got in the FN2 with a couple more digital elements. You've got a very Nissan GT-R-esque sort of G-meter readout and things like that going on over here. You have dual zone climate control, just as you got with nicer versions of the old FN2. You got a pretty small steering wheel, which feels pretty good in the hand, even if it isn't giving me an awful lot of texture through it just yet. Now that gearbox, although early ones may have been quite fragile, and in truth I don't know if they actually ever improved them or not, is really nice to use. Very direct, very precise, very slick, and really as good as people tell you Honda gearboxes are. Now your pedals are all reasonably light, clutch, brake, accelerator, all nice and easy, and the controls come very naturally to you. Now this car isn't entirely standard, it's been fettled somewhat. Nothing crazy, just a few things to make it a touch more exciting. You see, its owner had a succession of Subarus and then went on the hunt for something which could replace it as a daily and also sometimes fun car. And he drove one of these in standard form and it just didn't excite him. And then tried an A45 and felt very much the same way about that. He also did a BMW M240 and felt that was also a touch anodyne, before he then settled on this. It's running 370 horsepower now, courtesy of the good people at AMD Tuning. It has a different exhaust, which you can definitely tell because it's a little boomy, and it may have some lowering springs. There's also an uprated intercooler and some other jiggery-pokery up front. I can tell you with authority that it does at least share one of the FK8's few weaknesses. In the wet, it's apparently completely useless. Not really a surprise when you consider that you're putting nearly 400 horsepower through the two wrong wheels. But it's not wet today, so what is this car like? Oh, it's a curious character, that's for sure. Now, the engine takes a little while to get going, but when it does, it's certainly got punch. I'm not entirely sure that exhaust note is to my taste, and it is rather boomy, which was a common criticism of the cars at the time. Putting an aftermarket system on it almost certainly won't have helped. In fact, the unusual 3-pipe layout on the FK8 was designed explicitly to help reduce the sort of boominess at cruising. And when you do put your foot down, you find the car trying to wander all over the place. And this can lull you into a false sense of security, because when you're driving normally and sensibly, the car's actually pretty well behaved. And to my memory, I don't think it's actually anywhere near as firm as the FN2 either. Now, if you are lusting after a rock-hard ride, there is a plus R button down here, which I think makes the suspension and everything about 35% stiffer or thereabouts. I have presently the sum total of 0 interest in pressing that button. The steering is definitely a weak point. It's got a really nice weighting to it, but it feels incredibly artificial. Honda don't often have much luck with steering. My S2000 isn't really that brilliant, and in fact, and I know I will be murdered for this, even the original NSX isn't great in that department either. Much better than this, mind, but it's just an unusual sensation. It feels like a force feedback wheel on a computer game, and that isn't something I will often say about a car, because it's one of those automotive journalist cliches that people like to wheel out, and very rarely is it actually true. For example, a Nissan GT-R's steering is nothing like this whatsoever. So let's put her on another slightly more challenging road and see how she copes with some slightly more difficult surfaces. The chassis, it must be said, I actually rather like. It takes this road much better than I thought it would. I was very much expecting to have my fillings shaken out. Honda definitely improved it over the FN2. It doesn't lack for pace either, but unfortunately, it's just not an enjoyable drivetrain. That engine at no point really gives me the fizz. It's effective, that's about it. It makes too much noise, and not a particularly nice one, and I'm thankful that there is a limited slip differential, because even with it fitted, this thing is borderline uncontrollable. Without one, heaven help you. The steering really is just unexciting. You get cars which are flawed and go all over the place, but can still be fun in the steering department. Case in point, the Ford Racing Puma that I drove the other day. But this is not one of those. It feels like it never weights up. It's just the same heavy steering at every single point in the lot. It's just not a rewarding rack to use. The brakes are perfectly decent, responsive, nice, and the gearbox is a genuine highlight. If you told me, I would actually believe you that this car was Italian, so flawed is it. I did only minimal research on this car, as I always tend to, and one thing that surprised me was how well these have held their money. When they came out, they didn't do so good when everybody realised they were, well, not a perfectly rounded vehicle. And then when the FK8 came out, I thought these were just going to drop right down to about 3 or 4 grand within a few years and join the FN2 as one of the least loved cars ever to come from Honda. However, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. In fact, the cheapest of the cheap still seem to be about £15,000 or £16,000. Now that's potentially a very good thing, because it means these will, in some cases, have been kept out of the hands of those who might have ruined them. The same crowd that have made Subarus, in many cases, so unenjoyable to go shopping for. Tragically, it is at its absolute best when you're driving it at about 5 or 6 tenths. When the chassis is actually reasonably compliant, and when you're not being dragged off into a hedge like some poor sap in the night. There are other good things about the car too, though. Servicing on these is not particularly expensive, and they have apparently been, in the last few years, generally reliable. In fact, this has had only one minor issue, which was sorted under warranty, so that's a good thing. You'll still find plenty of these at Honda main dealers, so if you want, you can buy one with all the peace of mind of a manufacturer-approved used car. It's an unusual looking car still, and I know a lot of people actually prefer the way that it looks compared to the later FK8. The engine has very little go in it, below about 3,000 RPM. However, I have seen the dyno graph, and it is indeed smooth and nice power, all the way to a peak which you arrive at around 6,500. Those wanting peak RPM figures to start with a 9 will probably want to look elsewhere. So the main reasons I would say to someone to go for an FK2 would be if you want something that is extraordinarily practical. The seats are excellent, both front and rear. Boot space is cavernous. That's not going to cost you too much to run. And it is a little bit different, but my advice, don't go chasing big power figures, because what it has as standard, for me, would probably be enough. But that's the way I see it. This car's owner, I know, likes the roller coaster ride feel, and this definitely gives you that. You put your foot down, you hang on and hope for the best. And so far, I seem to have come out the other side alive, which is nice. So that there is my take on the Honda Civic Type R FK2. Thank you for watching. Thanks to this guy's owner for bringing it out. We'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.